Hi guys, welcome to Office Blokes React. I'm Office Bloke Dave.
I'm Office Bloke Daz.
Together we are two of the Office Blokes.
Just the two of us today.
Just two of us today. It has been all week, but Mike is hopefully going to be back next week.
Guess who's back? He's coming back next week, yep.
Yep. So I know people miss him when he's gone. I've seen a few comments. Yeah,
I've missed him a few times.
I think
I've had them guns like these guys shooting out the window.
Yeah.
And he's going, can't get me, can't. And he's zigzagging up and down the road. I'm like,
I missed him in my car a couple of times
as well. Yeah,
forwards and backwards. I tried reversing over him. Nothing. Slippery bastard.
It's good to see he's back though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As he's running down the road and he's shooting a good target.
Yeah, Mike will be back. Don't worry about it. But we have got a new competition. We did the competition to win the hat. I have announced the winner in a YouTube short, so you're going to have to go and find that because I've literally just forgot the guy's name as I'm talking.
It'll come to me in a minute.
I've got the screenshot on my phone here.
He's called Nolan Warnock.
You know what? I think you're right. That sounds very right. Nolan Warnock. Wow. Fair play.
Good memory.
Yeah, so drop us an email, officeblokesreact@gmail.com, to figure out how we're going to get the hat over to you.
Yeah.
But if you want to look like the sexiest, updated version of Uncle Roger that there possibly can be, bright orange OB polo, all you've got to do is comment Mike's WAP on our WAP lyric read-through and you could get it. There you go.
And be subscribed.
And be subscribed, yeah. Smells like Mike's WAP. Fresh. Anyway, what...
Definitely not fresh if it's Mike's WAP. That's why he's not here.
Well, it wasn't orange before it touched his WAP.
It's getting polished.
Anyway, what US would be like if America had lost the revolution?
Ooh.
Interesting one, this, because at the time of the revolution we were probably the global superpower, weren't we?
Probably. Or one of them.
I think we were, at that point, biggest navy, best navy in the world.
Yeah, probably.
I wouldn't mind betting we were number one, and then America splintered off, and then we started slowly going down the rankings, and they started going.
It's like snakes and ladders. We were almost at the top, and then all the way down.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of our culture over there as well. How different do you think things would be day to day now?
I think it would have changed a few years after.
You think it just would have delayed the revolution by another 10 years or so?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. Let's get into it then. What US would be like if America lost the revolution? Let's get into it.
And conquered. The opening shots of the American Revolution pitting a scrappy colonial army against the might of the British Empire. It was the culmination of years of harsh treatment from the English forces, including the massacre of peaceful protesters in Boston and the tax hikes that led to the Boston Tea Party. And the world watched as the ultimate underdogs led by George Washington turned back the forces of Great Britain and created a new country, the United States of America. But what if it didn't work out that way? 700 British soldiers had been sent to destroy colonial supplies and cut off the rebellion before it could start. Warning was given by Paul Revere and the other riders of the British arrival. But in this timeline, a stray butterfly spooked the horses of the warning team, keeping them from ever reaching their destinations. The British swept in and captured the arms caches and arrested the ringleaders planning to fight the British. Prominent founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were interrogated by the British, likely disavowing all involvement, but one thing was sure: there would not be an American Revolution in this timeline. Under the hard-nosed approach by King George III, the potential revolution had been quelled, and he would likely take care to make sure it never repeated. British troops would maintain a strong presence in the colonies, rooting out any sign of rebellion. George was infamous as the king who had the harshest approach toward the colonies, spurring increased resistance, but it's likely that after a close call, he might have been advised by those he trusts to hold off on any new taxes for a while. After all, the colonies were a valuable resource, so it's likely that the status quo would have remained in place for the next few decades, as long as George III remained in power.
I wonder if, much like the Vikings did, our soldiers over there in this scenario would have just assimilated, and then just become Americans, but by virtue of just being there. Rather than it being a whole separate country and it be as grandiose, it'd just be they just develop that culture.
Yeah, I mean the communication sort of like scene there wouldn't have been a telephone call, would it?
No.
It took months to sort of like get anything back and forward, or weeks at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be a while. George III had a reputation of being a bit of a disaster, but he was actually the longest reigning king in British history, serving for almost 60 years. His successor, George IV, was seen as a dilettante who only reigned for 10 years. Selfish and irresponsible, his reign was heavily influenced by his advisors, and as such, it's likely they just would have advised him to keep things going under his father's colonial policies for the term. After all, there were parties to attend back in London. But back in the colonies, things have changed a lot. Many of the founding fathers who defined the march to independence have since passed away, with Franklin and Washington likely not having anywhere near the influence on history they did in our timeline. However, it's likely an independence-minded movement continues in the colonies, focused less on fighting for independence than on developing the colony's culture, and they have a lot of room to do it in. While the original United States post-revolution was only composed of 13 colonies, the British territories they're part of now are much larger, including much of what's now Canada. And the crisis happening in another country might be as big a factor as what's happening in England. While the American Revolution didn't happen in this timeline, odds are another revolution did, the French Revolution. The circumstances there were primarily driven by poverty and populist rage against an out-of-touch monarch. And while it's possible that the American events helped to influence it, they also quickly spiraled out of control, and the Americans who supported it in our timeline were rather ineffectual at pushing it in their direction. And some were even imprisoned for their efforts. So odds are that Danton and Robespierre still rose, and the King and Marie Antoinette still wound up facing Madame Guillotine. And the Reign of Terror still sent France into chaos until it fell, leading to the rise of Emperor Napoleon. And that would give Britain the leverage it needed. France and Britain have long been bitter enemies, and in our timeline, both saw their empires decline significantly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain saw itself lose its colonies, while France lost much of its territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War. That gave Britain a dominant foothold in North America, including control of the French-speaking territory of Quebec. So with France relegated to rump territory in the continent and dealing with political upheaval,
it's interesting to think that the States were like a series of French colonies, British colonies, Spanish colonies, and this idea that you go and take it and it becomes America is a completely different thing when it's a proxy war against France or against Spain or whatever to take colonies.
Yeah, when you look back at history, like dating back further than this, the dominant forces were France, Spain, and Britain.
Yeah.
So you look across the globe now, and you look at places like the Philippines, and all around Asia, and that's very Spanish.
Yeah,
very Spanish influence. Most places are influenced by these European superpowers. And you look at all the wars of all time; they're all around Europe.
Yeah, pretty much. You're right. And I know there's a lot of French-speaking African nations and stuff as well, isn't there?
A hell of a lot, yeah.
Odds are that Britain would have been able to take America's place in the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s, giving the country near total dominance of North America with only Spain to oppose it. But the dominant country would be able to face a major challenge. The United States' history was largely one of expansion for most of its first 70 years, but a major crisis was brewing: slavery. The new country chose to keep the oppressive institution to appease the southern states, although it did abolish the slave trade in 1807. This just led to it creating harsher rules to keep its enslaved population in perpetual bondage. It wasn't until the 1860s, after a brutal civil war, that the United States abolished slavery, and even then it was over a century before the system of racial oppression in the South would be addressed. But in this timeline, things would be very different. You might think that under a colonial power, progress might be even slower. After all, Britain helped bring the institution of slavery to the continent of North America, along with other colonial powers. But actually, the slave trade was abolished in Great Britain the same year as it was in the United States, and pressure continued amongst abolitionist members of Parliament to eliminate the institution for good. The result was that in 1833, Great Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which eliminated the possession of slaves in the country and all territories controlled by it, with the exception of those managed by the East India Company. That included the massive North America territories. So how does this play out across the pond? The abolition of slavery in the UK went relatively smoothly because Great Britain was not an agricultural-driven market. It was a relatively small island nation quickly becoming a hub of India. The United States might not have been independent at this point, but odds are its territorial breakdown is still fairly similar. You have the industrialized northern states and the more agricultural southern states, which are making much more heavy use of slaves. And as word starts to spread that the institution might be coming to an end, odds are we'd see some rebellion. And instead of a civil war, it's time for the American Revolution 2.0? Things could have been very different if the United States lost an extended revolution back in the 1770s, but in this timeline it was crushed with relatively little effort by the British. That means that the colonies would have been allowed to develop at their own pace under the oversight of the Crown. and they likely have all their own governors and local political figures. It's impossible to know if someone who is a governor or a senator in the US would still be prominent here, but there are some figures who are such major players who are so determined to make their voices heard that it's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't emerge in any circumstance. And so enters John C. Calhoun into the fray. The fiery South Carolina radical rose to prominence in the United States as the only vice president to lead a rebellion against his own president, supporting South Carolina in a dispute with the federal government over tariffs. He would later emerge as one of the most prominent figures in the lead-up to the Civil War, refusing any concessions to abolitionists and advocating for secession if the institution of slavery was infringed upon. He would die 10 years before the Civil War began, but his fiery speech in Congress is seen by many as the turning point where conflict was inevitable. And in this timeline, the crisis over slavery happened several decades earlier. Instead of being a dying old war horse in 1850, Calhoun is a hail fire breather of 51 in 1833, when the word of the Slavery Abolition Act filters down from Parliament. Odds are he's a powerhouse in South Carolina colonial politics, perhaps even the governor, and he proved that he was anything but shy when it came to opposing the government. So odds are good that when the attempt to persuade the Crown out of passing the bill failed, he would be ready to defy them and try to create the Confederacy 30 years early. But this would be a very different conflict. The map of the country looks a little different in this timeline, with the much larger territory of Canada joining it. However, it's unlikely that Great Britain would have been quite as involved in the southern border and looking to take territory from Spain. So it's possible that Texas would not be a part of the United States. This means the Confederacy is little more than a rump state consisting of the southern states from Virginia to Florida, against one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. While in the U.S. Civil War, the two territories were relatively even, with the Confederacy winning key early victories and even making inroads into the North in places like Pennsylvania, the odds are this time the war goes much more quickly, because the British are coming. The early rebellion would likely be fierce and take colonists by surprise. The odds are the southern troops might be able to take some territory to defend their region, because the North would not be expecting a fight from their fellow colonies. But when word got back to the Crown about what was going on, they would be likely to respond fiercely, while the United Kingdom stayed neutral in the Civil War and even considered giving aid to the Confederacy to weaken their old enemies. This time the whole force of the British Empire would be bearing down on the rebels, and the man in charge would have a big role in it. George IV passed away in 1830 and left no heirs, so his success...
So far, I'm not convinced that things would look that different nowadays based off any of this.
No, it's and like I said, I think it was probably just delaying the inevitable anyway.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see sort of like the division of old and whether that ever replicates itself going forward into the future.
Do you mean like on a state-by-state basis?
So something like Texas becoming, or California becoming its own independent,
seceding from the
from the United States. Yeah,
I don't think that'll ever happen. I know there's talk.
Not
of
in our lifetime, I don't think. But
things
talking
change.
about in hundreds of years, maybe.
Yeah,
you know, things do change a lot, and there's a lot of division around the world at the moment.
Absolutely,
in many countries,
it's growing significantly, isn't it? I also wonder, because I think Spanish may be either the most or the second most spoken language in the States, isn't it?
I imagine English is number one. Spanish probably two.
I'm sure I heard something ages ago that was Spanish had taken over it, but who knows? Maybe it's the fact that a lot of Spanish speakers are bilingual and a lot of English speakers only have one language. Something to do with that. But I just wonder if, because we'd have essentially taken the whole of America here and Spain are gone, France are gone, would there be as many Spanish speakers there nowadays?
Well, I think the influence from South America is what brought the Spanish speakers to America.
Right.
I don't think that's the influence of... I don't think there's many Spanish nationals there. It's not like of origin.
You don't think it's Spanish colonialism that's kind of brought the language?
Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I think it's influence from South America and Central America.
Yeah.
That's sort of like... It's brought it in from that way.
I can't see much being different there. I suppose our roads would probably be better over here because we'd have taken all of the taxes from the US and
use them to pay over
built our infrastructure.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, division. You know, when you look at sort of like a lot of stuff that's being sort of like put in the ways now, there's a lot of inflation around the world. There's a lot of unrest around the world on economic values, and sometimes that's when breakaways come about. Yeah, sort of thing, saying, well, we can do this better ourselves. You know, we've got the infrastructure to do it, and we belong. You know, you only have to look at like the Baltic states and things like that. Not Baltic, what are they called? like Czechoslovakia and turned into
Yeah.
Slovakia and Czech Republic and Bosnia and all around there, Serbia. Don't know what everything that happened all around there. They all went independent, and that was something different. I know.
Yeah.
But it was. But you see them breakaways coming back against the Soviet Union. You see what Russia's trying to do now in the Ukraine.
God, look at Scotland. You know,
Scotland.
Even though Sturgeon's been arrested now, so that may have quashed that a little bit.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
There's a big push for independence from a lot of people. There's
There is.
a big push in Ireland to unify Ireland
Correct.
from certain people.
Yep.
So I mean, it's an ever morphing.
And that's bubbling higher up now as well. It's
Yeah.
getting higher and higher. But obviously that's something to do with the Brexit thing. But this could have the same thing
Same
going
sort of
forward. Yeah.
effect.
But I think not at the moment. I think in years to come, a lot of people in America might tell us different, saying that there is a lot of intention boil. Especially I've seen a lot of stuff on what they call Texit, which is Texas.
Yeah.
Exit in the USA. I don't think that'll ever happen in our lifetime.
No.
But you never know. Things can change in a flash.
I suppose all it takes is some government overreach in certain states, and then people from other states to say that doesn't represent my values, views, and opinions, and then division just grows and grows and grows. Interesting.
But I think the two locks in. If anything, they'll probably take over somewhere else, make the USA bigger.
Do you think they could have an empire as such? I think they've already got an empire
The
with
days are over now.
with the military bases all over the world. I think they've already got an empire.
I think
just
to take
without-
over countries and be part of the USA is probably unless there was actually financial ruin in a country that they'd have to say, well, we could take you in, but we'd bail you out, but you become a US state type thing.
You become like a satellite state.
Successor was William IV, his younger brother, and one of the oldest monarchs to ever take the throne at 65. But while he only reigned for 7 years due to his age, he was one of the most consequential kings of the era. A reformer and a strong leader, he approved of the abolition of slavery and also restricted child labor and improved the welfare system. However, he believed in keeping the British Empire strong and would not take well to a rebellion. And the Second American Revolution would go down just like the first. The early successes of the Southern Rebellion would be short-lived, as reinforcements streamed over from Great Britain and delivered arms and soldiers. Any colonial resistance would be met with far superior forces, and the odds are that the Southern slaveholders would suffer heavy losses early on. William IV would perhaps offer them a chance to surrender, a wise move, but Calhoun, as the ringleader of the rebellion, would be unlikely to take the olive branch, so his army would go down in flames, and the British crown would be unlikely to deal as kindly with him as the United States did with Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, bringing an end to the institution of slavery in the American colonies. And from there, things might work out surprisingly well. The path to abolishing slavery in our timeline was bumpy, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln kneecapping efforts to enforce racial equality and a compromise over a possibly stolen election a decade later, leading to the end of most Reconstruction efforts. This would lead to a century of racial oppression and segregation in the South. But in this timeline, the British would be responsible for overseeing the aftermath, and they would likely keep tighter control of the southern colonies. The aid of the northern colonies in the war effort would mean the colonies as a whole wouldn't be punished, but the rebellious territories would likely see a heavier British presence for a long time. And any local officials who aided in the rebellion would likely see themselves forced out of power permanently. But a lot of this would have to do with a new figure. The elderly William IV would be dead by 1837, and he would be replaced by not another king, but by his niece Victoria, in the latest complex succession. Victoria took office at only 18 years old, and her reign was one of the most consequential in British history. She was known as a strong supporter of British expansionism and would reign for 63 years, the longest term of service in the history of the British Crown until the modern day. So, the fate of the colonies would to a large extent be determined by the whims of this woman. Well, sort of. Britain has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and additional restrictions on the monarch's power were put into place since. This meant that Parliament has much of an impact on the laws of the time as Queen Victoria, and some monarchs were much more powerful than others. Victoria would inherit a British Empire at its peak, as well as an unsettled status quo in the North American colonies. But the leadership of these colonies in helping to put down the rebellion of the southern states would be in good standing with the British government, and the region would be seen as the crown jewel of the territories. And that means one major question would be brewing. We all know how the United States gained independence in our timeline, but what about Canada? It was a much more sedate affair, with the British territories holding conferences to ask for independence and negotiating an exit from the United Kingdom. There was no revolution, and in many ways the British were ready to let it go. They wanted the country to defend itself, to take the financial burden off of them, and many English-Canadian nationalists wanted to unify the territories and consolidate their control over French-speaking Quebec.
I wonder if you end up with a unified Canada and America after they kick us out in this scenario, and it's just one humongous landmass of a country.
It could have been, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Quite easily have been.
You know, you've got the Canadians trying to get independence, and then there's whispers of it in the south of what is now America, and then there's a few chats, a few sort of meetings between them, and it's like Canada are going to support the southern states, and then unified North America.
Yeah, possibly. But I'm not, like I say, I'm not very good on history. History's not my strong point.
It's not mine either.
By a long way. It's interesting. So I'm learning a lot with these videos like this.
Yeah. I've got a memory like a sieve, so like I used to be able to remember things, but that's where history is a problem now. Show me a war movie with historical things in it. I remember that. If I read books or watched documentaries, it's like...
Obviously, then the Canada becomes a part of the Commonwealth. It comes away from Britain as a part of Britain, but then still a member of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So it still has the benefits of what the Commonwealth bring.
I'm not sure what they are.
It was still governed by the Queen, wasn't it?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right.
So it was governed by the... Now it's... Well, I don't think it is anymore. I think that might be a thing of the past now. I'm not sure if it's still like under the Queen rule.
They've got the Queen on the money.
Or the King. Well, King now it is, isn't it? King. Keep forgetting.
That's the point. The Canadians have to replace all their money because we've got
Australia.
A king. Wow.
Same. There's quite a lot of countries that have the monarchy on the money.
I think along this timeline, the world has liberalised massively, and colonialism has become a lot more unpopular. So it's inevitable that the States had become its own thing. But whether or not it became its own thing with Canada, or whether or not it became multiple countries within what we now know as the States or something, it's hard to say.
But if you look at the whole of North America, including Mexico, then it's a humongous landmass.
Yeah.
But with no significant tension with the parent country, there was no desire for a hard break. So when Canada became independent, they chose to remain a Commonwealth country and maintain the Queen as their head of state while becoming autonomous in all government affairs. Would the same have happened to the United Territories in this alternate timeline? It is possible, but there are a few things in the way. For one, the United States is much more fertile territory and had many more resources than Canada. Almost doubling the territory gives Britain almost an entire continent to control. But it also means higher cost to administer the territory. The odds are that Victoria and Parliament would be open to these negotiations for independence, but they might drive a harder bargain, wanting preferable trade deals long-term with the new country to ensure access to its resources. Whatever the terms of the deal, odds are they would be preferable to what had been imposed on them by the British Crown as a colony. And so this new country is born into a whole different world. In an instant, the United States of North America was born and became the largest country in the world by sheer space, containing all the territory of Canada and much of the modern-day United States. It would have the benefits of decades of buildup from the British Empire, as well as the scars of a recent rebellion. But in this time of growth, it's not the only country in North America to benefit. With the American Revolution never happening, Spain likely had the Southwest mostly to itself. Without the boost of the American Revolution to the hopes of the colonized countries worldwide, would Mexico have successfully won its own war in 1821? The Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. So it's possible that the Southwest North America would still be dominated by the Spanish crown, holding not just Mexico, but most of what's the American Southwest today. So is another war brewing? Probably not. While the territories...
I was going to mention that Alaska is owned by Russia at this point as well.
Yeah, and Russia sort of like, weren't they, a couple of months ago, weren't they claiming that it should still be theirs?
I think they sold it to America.
They did.
And I think it was for like $1 million or something relatively insignificant. Because it was just...
They were talking not long ago that it should be theirs by right. Bit similar to like the Ukraine and everywhere else that he wants to dabble in. But that's why Mike's wearing his sombrero today. It's to celebrate the...
representing the Spanish colonies.
Correct, yeah.
There's one response to Putin saying Alaska should be part of the US. There's one thing the Americans need to say is come and take it.
Yeah.
I dare you.
Yeah.
Come and try. I mean, it'd be a disaster for the whole world if they did, but just by saying that to him, he'd go, actually, we'll...
just don't take his call. Just say, tell him I'll call him back.
Put him on hold for like an hour.
He's still there. Yeah, he'll be right with you.
Of North America did eventually gain independence. They're all far from abandoned by Great Britain, Instead, they're likely considered extended family, and if someone punches your cousin, odds are you're jumping into the fray. So Spain would be very cautious about trying to take any territory from this new country and vice versa. While it's possible the two empires could go to war again, maybe provoked by similar events to the Spanish-American War, that would be a much larger conflict and not likely to erupt immediately. So it's possible that Texas and California might never be united with the rest of the territory, but the new country is also very much not in need of extra territory. But this would change a lot of things going forward, including for many of the area's most oppressed people. What would happen to the Native Americans in this new status quo? It wouldn't be all sunshine and roses, since the British, like all colonial powers, were responsible for mass displacement and murder. But certain key atrocities might have been averted. There was never a President Andrew Jackson in this timeline, so there was never a trail of tears. Much of the United States' worst atrocities toward natives happened in the rush west, which would have happened in a much more orderly method in this timeline. However, the US and Canada shared certain atrocities, such as the residential schools where native children were taken from their parents and forcibly educated to behave more like white people. Those would still exist here under the British and the new government, but there's hope for a better future. Today, Canada's programs of reparations and autonomy for natives go further than the US, and that might carry over in the Union. But what about the victims of slavery? Well, for one thing, slavery ends 30 years earlier. That's generations of people who aren't born into bondage. The worst of segregation never happens as well, but for the millions of people who become free when slavery ends, things would likely turn out very differently. The British control huge swaths of territory in Africa and the Caribbean, and the odds are they might offer some former slaves, especially those taken near the end of the slave trade, the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland. It's impossible to know how many would take the offer, but odds are most would not want to be displaced if they had built a life here. So today's country might be an equally diverse place, but one without the century of racial tension that culminated in the growing pains of the civil rights movement. And in some ways, history bends toward the same end. The territory did eventually gain independence, but with much less bloodshed. And most of European history proceeded apace, including eventually the World Wars. The growing tension between Germany and the rest of Europe would still have happened, but with one big difference: the closer ties between the nation taking up most of North America and its former colonial power. In our timeline, Britain was largely left alone to fight the German-aligned forces sweeping across Europe for the first part of both wars, and it took major provocations to get the United States involved. A dirty German-Mexican deal the first time, and Pearl Harbor the second. But this time, as a Commonwealth nation, we likely would have been eager to get involved and help Great Britain. Canada entered both wars long before the United States, and the added forces might have helped win World War I, and potentially ended Hitler's reign several years before the Allies were able to in our timeline. Which then raises the question, would it have been better if the United States didn't win its independence by revolution? It's unlikely that Britain would have kept the colonies forever, and even far-flung colonies like Australia gained their independence peacefully eventually. Part of this was the natural decline of the British Empire, but many countries were able to negotiate for an exit and the benefits of Commonwealth status without conflict. Some countries weren't so lucky in the modern era, including Kenya, which fought a difficult battle for independence in the 20th century. But a country largely seen as an extension of Britain would have had an easier go. So what would the country look like now? Well, for one thing, it would be the largest country in the world. Combining Canada and the United States makes it larger than Russia, and while there's no guarantee that it would have all the territories in the Southwest by now, it's likely to have expanded somewhat. Both the United States and Great Britain are strong economies, so this new country would have had the same strong infrastructure to build off. Of course, not everything would be sunshine and roses. All of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States still have problems with the treatment of non-white residents in their countries, and any colonial power will be dealing with its past sins for a long time. But it would likely stand alone as the world's greatest power. The United States is arguably the world's only superpower today, but the odds are good that Great Britain would have had much more power and influence than it does in our timeline. An early victory in World War II thanks to North America.
The map of our country looks like a shit jigsaw puzzle, doesn't it?
It really does.
Just like your pieces missing, you try to finish a jigsaw puzzle and you've got pieces missing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the same thing could be said about when he says there, the USA will be the largest country in the world now. And what about if Russia was still the USSR? Or if China still had the empires they had and took over India and Pakistan and Afghanistan and places like that. It's all a bit what ifs, isn't it?
Yeah, It's so hard to speculate on, but it seems like if America was granted independence rather than fighting for independence and was part of the Commonwealth, And then, like you said, World War One plays out the same sort of way. They're in it quicker, it's over quicker. But then the sanctions on Germany could have been even harsher, which led to World War Two. But then World War Two could have potentially been ticked off a couple of years quicker. Could have been better for the world, but then roll on to the Cold War. Could that have been worse? Like you say, if USSR is still one big thing, and it's not just them and America beefing as such, it's so hard to know, isn't it?
It's kind of turning around now. It's the way Putin's playing it now with his chess moves to, with what's going on.
Yeah, it's not going to end well for him, I don't think.
No, I saw him speaking today, but whether it was him or not, I don't know.
America entering earlier would have given Britain a stronger hand in negotiations post-war, and it would have kept many of its colonial holdings, while the anti-colonial movement would have continued and they likely would have given many of them independence. It might have been a smoother process. After all, their biggest colony wound up gaining independence peacefully. The only thing we know for sure, if the American Revolution didn't happen, there likely would have been a lot more tea and tears in North America when the Queen passed away. Want to know about some other historical hypotheticals?
Yeah,
that was a really interesting debate,
thought
experiment or whatever you call it.
If it would have been they would have given the states independence further down the line, it could have been, all different countries.
Yeah,
could have been very independent.
It could, it could literally be negotiations more on a state by state basis to become independent of the UK, rather than a unified America, and you end up with 10 countries in the US rather than it being one.
Correct.
Or, like he said, it could just be the one super country of Canada, and probably would have got Alaska as well if Russia still. I think that'd still happen, so it'd be this gigantic land.
I wonder what life would be without borders. Go anywhere.
I think things like wages would have to be the same across the board globally, because you just go to...
Companies would move, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
There'd be the incentives to do different things, but not, like I say, just one level everything.
It's kind of communism a little bit.
Tax is the same wherever you go.
I don't think it'd work.
No, it absolutely wouldn't.
I think it'd be a disaster, because as sad as it is, a lot of global growth is based off cheap labour, cheap foreign labour. You outsource we outsource everything to China, because they pay their workers less and don't treat them as well as we'd have to in this country.
It's not just that, you've got Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, places like that as well.
But then there'd be no incentive to go anywhere or do anything, because if wages and treatment are the same across the board, there's no borders. It's just kind of like it'd be stagnant. I think
it'd be bedlam.
You wouldn't look at other countries and think, I'm going to go and live over there.
I wonder if the world would spread out, or do you think they'll all just mass to certain areas?
I think it'd segregate more, personally, because you wouldn't have ever moved to the States for work, because there'd be no point, because everything's equal across the board, and then you wouldn't have had all that experience, and culture wouldn't exchange as much. I think everyone would be...
But I didn't move to the States for work. I moved to the States with work, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I went there. I went there because I chose to go there, because I wanted to enjoy a different culture and diversity and everything that goes with it, and living in different countries, and me being the foreign one. So I think, and that's what took me around the world in different places. I wanted to try out different things rather than stay 5 minutes from where I grew up, sort of thing.
But a world without borders may not have offered you you may not have wanted to do it, because everything's just homogenised. Well, everything's just the same.
Would now if I didn't have to use my passport for certain countries or visas and all that, I'd go.
That's something you didn't touch on there. We probably wouldn't need passports to go to the States, would we?
Yeah.
So I think
trying to get a visa for some countries is a ball ache.
Yeah, I bet.
And I'm like, forget it, I don't want to come. But if you get you get just no passport and just straight in and straight pick up your luggage and away you go. Different.
Well, almost like we had with Europe for 50 years and decided to get rid of.
You still needed your passport when you went to Europe.
You did, yeah, but we didn't need visas.
No, we didn't need visas. No. But
it was an interesting video. It's an interesting sort of debate to think about.
Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed it too. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll catch you on the next one.
Cheers, guys.